Hi, I'm Marie Woldring. I'm a junior psychological science major, minor in sociology. This is my book report video on No Place to Hide by Glenn Greenwald. The main theme of this book is the U.S. government surveillance. This book came out in 2014, so it's extremely relevant, and the topic of this book was discovered in 2013, so not too long ago. So in chapters 1 and 2, they weren't that important to the overall point of the book, but they tell the story of how Greenwald came into contact with Edward Snowden. So Snowden had initially contacted Greenwald anonymously via email. Snowden had told Greenwald to enable encryption devices on his computer in order to receive the documents he was going to send him. However, Greenwald took a few weeks to months to act on this, at which point one of his associates, Laura, was contacted him as well and said that she had also received an anonymous tip from someone about a similar topic that he had been referencing to, at which point they decided to collaborate and look into the source. From that point, they both enabled the encryption devices on their computers, which allowed them to actually get into contact with Snowden. After this, Greenwald and Laura traveled to Hong Kong along with one of Greenwald's co-workers from The Guardian, which was the journalist he had worked for, where they met Snowden. This is where Greenwald was introduced to the wide plethora of information that Snowden had obtained from the U.S. government. So from there, chapter 3 kind of goes into a summary of the different surveillance programs. So just as a general overview of these programs, one of them was called the Boundless Informant. This one is where the National Security Agency, the NSA, counts all of the telephone calls and emails of all around the world. So there was also part of the book that had said that the U.S. government did not know the exact amount of telephone calls and the length of these calls from its citizens, but that was a blatant lie because this exact program was designed to create that. They also talk about the Blarney, which is that accesses high-capacity international fiber optic cables. So this one was one of the higher-up ones. It didn't look so much at the U.S. citizens, but the officials of the U.S. Oak Star was a foreign telecommunication systems. Fairview accesses data controlled by legal authorities. So many of these programs were overseen by the Special Sources Operations Unit, the SSO. This unit wasn't even known about until 2013, 2014. Until then, it was an extremely secret sector of the National Security Agency. And additionally, there were many companies that were involved in collaborating with the NSA, including Google, Skype, Facebook, Microsoft, Twitter, all of them. However, many of these companies claim to hand over what they were legally obligated to by the government, but this is not true at all. The NSA is only able to get search warrants on specific individuals, and then from there look into their internet history and their call history. So these mass investigations were not legal whatsoever. This extended past the United States, as into Canada, as well as the UK and Australia and such. This chapter also introduces the concept of metadata, which we discussed in class. This is the analysis of a series of communications, not the content of these communications. So This can tell a lot about a person, but it can also be misconstrued. For example, like we talked about in class, a woman could call her mom, call her boyfriend, call a local Planned Parenthood agency, and then that would be the end of the sequence. And although you would not know the content of these discussions, you could conclude a lot about just who she had called and the length of the calls. So then the chapter goes into detail about the X key score, which is the NSA's widest reaching system for collecting online data. This is the system that allows the NSA to collect real-time monitoring of people's activities. The scary part about this, which they talk about, is once an analyst is able to get in the X key score, there is no authorization needed to gain access into everyone's personal files. So if someone can crack that code like Edward Snowden did, he has access to all of everyone's real-time conversations, data, everything. So the chapter ends with Greenwald summarizing about how all of this spying is able to lead to the maximization of U.S. government control. They have the most power over us and every other world nation just because they know what we're doing, when we're doing it. And this is extremely maximizing how much they can control everyone, all of their citizens. So then chapter 4 kind of goes into question about how does all of this surveillance affect us. One quote I really thought was relevant was on page 174. It says, "It is the realm of privacy where creativity, dissent, and challenges to orthodoxy germinate." So Greenwald then references Orwell's book, 1984. In this book, people were never really knew when they were being watched. However, there was always a possibility they were being watched, and because of this, they were able to stay in line. So that's kind of similar to what we're looking at now. Even though they're not always looking at our conversations, there's always the possibility that they could be. So why is the government doing this? Right now, the U.S. is in, and as it was in 2013, is in worsening economic inequality as well as instability. This is seen in the markets of Spain and Greece, two countries that were relatively stable before a few years ago, as well as in America, where both the right wing and the left wing have in the recent years had different rallies, like the I can't remember what it was. The Occupy Wall Street on the left side, stuff like that. He also talks about the argument that government surveillance is for the benefit of the greater population, but Greenwald kind of puts down this argument because it really puts a line between bad people and good people. And for example, not only are people getting looked at for their crimes, but they're also being looked at for things that just maybe aren't great but aren't illegal, and that is just never good. And he also goes into some statistics about how at this point more Americans are concerned about their government surveillance than about terrorists and the problem of terrorism. So chapter 5 describes some of the backlash of releasing the documents. For example, Snowden was targeted by the media. Snowden did not want any media attention. He wanted the government surveillance to be the main point in media portrayal of this. However, many media reports really wanted to get interviews with him, but he refused for that reason. Additionally, Greenwald's friend and coworker David was detained in an airport immediately following the release of these documents due to what they claimed as the Terrorism Act of 2000, which questions people about their ties to terrorism, as it says in the name. It was found out that this was an attempt to intimidate Greenwald and David. They had nearly made it 9 hours in the detainment process of David at the airport, at which point he would have been arrested if the 9 hours had gotten up. They let him go minutes before the 9 hours was let up, and it just shows how he was targeted and how the government was able to do so because of his information and his ties, and just because of his name and his ties to Greenwald. So the overall thesis of this book, I thought was more of a question than anything else, but what are the implications of government surveillance? There are claims that people without secrets have nothing to hide, but it's not about that. People are different when they're alone versus when they're being watched, and that's not always a bad thing. In fact, it's usually a good thing. People aren't able to be creative and have their own free will if they're being watched all the time. They're always feeling insecure kind of about how they are supposed to act and how they're supposed to talk. So it hurts the human race as a whole if we're always being watched. So one thing I liked about this book was it was extremely compelling to read. It gave a lot of insight into a topic I really didn't know a lot about before I had read it. Being someone who doesn't look much into technology, it was kind of hard to grasp some of the programs, such as in chapter 3, but I felt that Greenwald did a really good job explaining it in a way that was able to be more understood by someone like me who doesn't get it as naturally. Additionally, I felt that Greenwald was able to make the reader think more deeply about what government surveillance actually means, by incorporating different stories and kind of different plot lines. Greenwald showed how many different agencies, companies, individuals are just involved in the surveillance process, and how many people it can affect worldwide. I also felt that this book was probably needed to be written, especially at the time that it was. The U.S. citizens just deserve to know what the government hasn't been telling us, and it took a lot of courage for Greenwald to write this, and he knew what the backlash of it would be, and he did it anyway, and I felt that that was very courageous. One thing I didn't like, however, was I felt that Greenwald went too in depth about his trip to Hong Kong in the second chapter. Although I know it was important for him to include this aspect, I felt that his time could have been better spent looking at the reactions of people to these documents after they had been released, rather than talking about just a trip and like the nitty-gritty of it. So that was one thing I didn't appreciate as much. Overall, the book was extremely engaging, and I'm really happy I read it just because I had learned so much about a topic I really didn't know about. And yeah, that's it.